Hi, I'm Lindsay Lyons, and today I'm going to be talking through a case study. And for this particular case study, it's when ethics and policies collide and kind of working through a challenging situation. Firstly, I think it's kind of important to establish the facts and talk about who is involved. So, to kind of set the scene, we have Richard Inman. He's the assistant principal, he's a first year principal there. We also have James. He's a Southside kid. He's known for having issues and being in trouble frequently. Then there is David. He's a young scholar. He's a trombonist. He's never been in trouble before. And also, there is a school police officer involved. There are a couple people that become secondarily involved, and this is James's teacher, James's mother, David's mother, and the director of secondary education. So now let's go through and kind of talk about what happened. I think this is easiest to do it in terms of numbered steps. So it kind of starts around fifth period. James's teacher witnessed him giving something to David, and she kind of suspected drugs, so she told Richard, the principal. The principal asks the school police officer to escort the boys out of class. And so now we're kind of in the office at this point. James and David both come, and the principal asks him what happened. James just said he gave David something to hold on to, and David breaks down and begins to shake and cry. And the officer ends up searching David and finds brass knuckles. These are a prohibited weapon and a felony offense, so a pretty serious situation. And so the officer handcuffs David. James ends up owning up to threatening David to take the brass knuckles, so we kind of bullied him into taking them. And Richard, the principal, kind of sees this as growth for James owning up to it. And Richard asks the officer to uncuff the boys, but the officer said, no, this is like a felony charge. They have to be taken to jail. And then kind of also keeping in mind that school policy demands that both students are expelled for no less to 45 days to the district's disciplinary alternative education program. So it's kind of a double doozy. And at this point, Richard feels really guilty and he's trapped by policy. He has to call both moms, varying responses. James's mom is like, leave him in jail, it will teach him a lesson. And David's mom is extremely upset, hangs up, comes down 15 minutes later. She doesn't understand why her son was a victim in being punished. And so if we kind of fast forward a little bit, the principal has to fill out that paperwork for them to go to the alternative school, but he does it for James, but he doesn't do it for David. He doesn't feel that that's ethically right at this point. And so David comes back to class. James goes to the alternative school. And Richard, the principal, ends up getting a call from the director of secondary education and demands that those papers be filled out to expel David. And if he doesn't fill those papers out, then he's going to have an official reprimand, which would be a negative thing for that principal. So kind of looking at this situation and what do? We've had a lot of people impacted. We have a lot of people upset. So what would be the best scenario in a very gray area? So kind of summarizing how the parties feel at this point, the different players. The principal feels really guilty. He doesn't want to ruin David's life. David has been a really good student up till this point, and he's a victim. And so he feels like having to expel him to that school is just causing more issues. David's mom is extremely angry and upset. She doesn't understand why her son's being punished if he's the victim. We've got James's mom, who's just kind of like, let him sit in jail. Maybe he'll learn. James has been down this road before, so he's, not really talked much in terms of his feelings. David is visibly upset, and the director of secondary education just wants the forms to be filled out because it's policy. So obviously some conflicting viewpoints are happening here. The next part that I want to talk about this case study is talking about some of the legal and ethical issues of it. And this case made me consider some of the following questions. So, is it okay to punish a kid for being a victim of bullying? If we're following policy, isn't there a policy that prevents bullying victims from being harmed? The law demands that both boys are arrested and charged with felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. So there is definitely legal issues there of the police officer following protocol. There's a prohibited weapon and he's doing what he can there. So there's definitely a legal support for it. And there's also a zero tolerance board policy to be expelled for no less than 45 days. So there's the legal policies, there's the school policies, and these things are really in conflict with kind of some of the ethical things. I think it's important to view this case through both a lens of ethical and legal decision making. I think sometimes those can maybe be in conflict, but something to highly consider. So if we continue looking at the legal or ethical issues, I want to analyze the ethical dimensions of issues. So what is right versus what is wrong is kind of a gray area in this situation, and also policy versus ethics. There's specific policies to expel the students, but the ethics of a situation is, why would you punish a victim? Isn't there policies that prevent bullying and protect the victim? So I do think there's conflicting policies. I know in our school district there are policies preventing bullying, so I think they didn't mention in this case, but that is definitely an angle to look at the case through. The law states that the students are arrested, policy states they should be expelled, but it's so unfortunate because the ethics don't match. And if we're trying as leaders to promote the academic success and personal well-being of each student and each adult, I think in this situation, we are not quite doing that following the policy and the law at this point. So continuing with the legal versus ethics, I think one thing that would be quite wise to do is to consult a mentor. So I'm the assistant principal. I probably have a principal there, potentially another assistant principal, and trying to figure out the best steps. What are my legal options that we know of versus my ethical feelings and what I can live with. And I did do some research, and there are several laws passed that link harassment and bullying. So I wonder if they could find a way to gear James's actions towards David to be more of the harassment side of this. They might have more of a law and policy on that side to be able to fight the other policies. And then also there is school districts that have a bullying policy of zero tolerance and provide steps to handle when situations happen like this. So I think for this case study, there was only certain legal and law and policies mentioned, but I feel like there are other policies in place, whether that's a bullying policy and harassment and stuff like that, that could also play a role. So I wonder if we looked at it from that side, if that would be beneficial. I kind of want to, we've talked about a lot, I want to kind of synthesize what is happening all at once in just kind of one sentence. So David's future has been jeopardized because of the actions of several people. And when the principal tries to not follow through with paperwork because of feeling guilty for David being a victim, the principal's ending up facing consequences himself for not following that policy. So it's a really tricky situation, unfortunately. So I kind of want to separate some things, the facts we know, and then maybe some things we can infer. So I kind of broke it into three separate categories: the people, the place, and the program. So people, we know Richard is the principal. We know James is kind of the South Side leader. He's known for causing trouble. David is an honors student. James is we know his fifth period teacher, James's mom, David's mom, and the director of education. Some people that I think are probably involved at some point that they didn't talk about is people like our NEA representatives, lawyers, definitely on the parent side. I think in this situation, a parent would definitely approach a lawyer, especially if she felt her son's treatment was really unfair. The place, we know that it is happening at Rocket Junior High. We know that the event happened kind of in the hallway. It ended up in the office. The youth detention facility was also there. Some things we don't know about the place is they imply some things about the South Side, but we don't know if they have various demographics based on that part of town. We can infer that it's a rough part of town, but we don't necessarily know. And then also keeping in mind that there might be biases based on the areas. Like the principal is only concerned about sending David to that school when at the same time James showed growth, but he didn't think much of sending him to that school. So I also think there's some issues there. The program, we know they're in junior high, and then we know we're dealing with the disciplinary education program as well. They talk about kind of in age being 13, and I think something to keep in mind is that these are such young kids, and the ages I teach is 12 and 13, so there are definitely certain traits and aspects to be considered when dealing with a youth of that age. So if I were to prioritize things that are happening right now, there's quite a few people that have are involved in this high stakes situation. You know, we have number one, Richard feels really guilty and he's facing potential disciplinary action on his own for trying to handle the situation. David's future is also being risked, his whole future. David's mom is obviously concerned about her son's future. James is continuing the cycle of, causing issues. And the head of secondary education also has a stake for enforcing policy and enforcing kind of the laws they have. Some other relevant stakeholders to kind of keep in mind. I think other parents, they don't talk about this, but I think if this were to get out, other parents would be really worried if their children were victims of bullying. I also think the district, they have a certain perception and trust in the decision making that needs to be present in there in a consistency. NEA kind of could be involved in protecting the employee rights, and lawyers potentially in the situation of protecting the child's rights. So I think there's other people that could definitely be involved that's not talked about in the situation. So if I were to learn more, I would want to know, are there other options to learn even more about certain situations? I think of things like consulting NEA. I know we have a representative at our school that can answer a lot of questions for us and let us know our rights from our contract, what we do and do not legally have to do, stuff like that. I also think it wouldn't be a bad idea to consult some lawyers as things escalate, or consulting other principals and mentors. And I probably would need more information to make a decision at this point. Kind of evaluating what I know and what I've researched, there are about 4 options that I really think are present. So the first option is to take no action. And there's several consequences, like you're not being seen as a leader. And I'm pretty sure if you take no action, there's going to be more disciplinary action to deal with. I think option 2 is refusing to fill out the expulsion paperwork for David. And again, consequences is that formal reprimand and also showing favoritism. He sent James with kind of out even thinking about it, even though technically David was in possession as well. So a very tricky situation. Option 3 would be to just fill out the expulsion papers for David, do the policy, and consequences are you're punishing a bullying victim and potentially ruining a lot of the student's future. Another option, the 4th option, is refuse to fill out David's expulsion papers and end up maybe consulting NEA, figuring out what he has to do, what are his rights, what are his protections. Consequences, we're still facing that disciplinary action of that formal reprimand, and maybe talking to NEA and they're kind of like, you're not really supported in that. So something to kind of keep in mind. So now in section 7, I would like to analyze each decision. I want to talk about the pros and the cons, and I just want to make sure as I'm going through this that I'm advocating for ethical and legal decisions. So let's analyze each of the options and look at the pros and cons. So if I took no action as that principal, the pro is, I guess, you don't have to make a decision, but the cons is that the situation's not going to resolve itself, and I think there would be more consequences that could even lead to you being fired if you just didn't handle a situation. The second option is refusing to fill out the expulsion paper for David. I think the pro of this is that you might feel less guilty because you're not ruining David's life. I think that this would be potentially an option that would model that ethical behavior and how you conduct yourself personally and build those relationships with both students and staff and parents. And I also think you'd be maybe protecting a victim of bullying. I think the cons is that you're facing that formal reprimand, you're not following policy, and there is some law in there that you're also not following. You're also seen as making exceptions. If you're going to make an exception for David but not for James, what are the consequences of that? Because James is still at the alternative school, and it also could potentially be seen as stereotyping, as because David has been good this whole time, then necessarily, he was a victim of bullying and it was good for James to stand up. There is the small possibility that maybe James wasn't telling the truth and David was involved. So definitely stuff to consider there as well for both law and ethics. Option 3 is that he fills out the expulsion paper for David. Pros, he's not going to face that disciplinary action from work. He's following policy. Both students are receiving the same treatment, and there's no favoritism. The negative would be that you're punishing a bully victim, you potentially ruining David's life. You're also dealing with a really upset parent. You're maybe being seen as unreasonable or even maybe unethical in some of your staff eyes. So just kind of keeping that in mind and living with potentially that guilt that if you would have handled the situation differently at first, it may have been different. Option 4, I think refuse to fill out David's expulsion papers and maybe have a follow-up conversation with the director of secondary education while at the same time consulting NEA. I think that the pros of this would be you'd feel less guilty about not ruining David's life. You'd ethically be able to maybe reason why. You're protecting a victim of bullying. You're also consulting potential legal representation. You're getting another opinion about your rights when you talk to NEA. And then maybe even by this cultivating ethical behavior in others, maybe if you could have a follow-up conversation with that director of secondary education, you'd be able to reach a different conclusion, and maybe consulting other people would give you more facts to kind of support your side. The cons are, I still think you might be facing disciplinary action. You're not following policy. You're seen as making exceptions since James still at the alternative school. And again, that favoritism and stereotyping would be an issue here as well. So making a final decision, if I were to make a final decision with kind of the little that I know about this story and through some of the research, after analyzing each option, I would go with option 4, I believe. I would refuse to sign the papers. I would have a follow-up conversation with that director, and I would consult potentially NEA before. They might be able to help me figure out ahead of time what my rights are, what are some things that I should say. I know our representative at our school is really good at navigating tricky situations and understanding both policy and law and your rights. And the director is just one person. He's not necessarily the end all be all for that. There are many other people at district. So I think it would even not be a bad idea to reach out to someone else, involve other people in the conversation. And I think this also allows time for you to consult and think about everyone involved and who has a stake in this. It allows you to be able to weigh your options, and I think collaboration is going to be something that would be helpful for this situation, having everyone work together to trying to find a situation. It sounds like there's a little bit of just wanting the situation to potentially go away, and I think if we could work together with the secondary director of education and even more people, I think a creative solution could be reached. I think it's just kind of thinking in black and white right now. So my plan of action that I would take, here are some of the steps I would take. I would consult my NEA school representative about the situation and my rights, because I necessarily know that some situations may happen at school where you're able to kind of also put in an explanation if you were to get a formal reprimand of your side of the story, so that both could be present in the future. Also, prepare for that follow-up conversation with the director. I would do a little bit more research, a little bit more support, talking to maybe some other principals. And then I would also create a backup plan if I can't resolve it by the conversation alone. I'm hoping a follow-up conversation might be better. Maybe the first conversation I wasn't completely prepared, but maybe if I could present the situation, what I'm worried about, potential policies that could support my side, I think that could be beneficial. Some things that might happen from this is it's possible that the director won't agree and I could still be facing that official reprimand. I do think a positive is it could inspire a collaboration with those key stakeholders. I think if someone at district, someone like on the legal representative side, and myself and the parent could get together and find a solution, I think that would be better overall. I also think you'd be potentially protecting a victim. And then I also think it'd be a good idea, if it works out, that you can kind of inspire your staff members of coming up with creative options, especially when policies seem to be really stringent. But it is important that he still keeps in account the legal side of things and what he can do legally. And then who needs to know kind of after decisions reached? Definitely David and David's mom, because they're the ones who are really going to be impacted by if we're able to change him going to that alternative school. So my plan B, what if it doesn't work? What if talking to him, consulting the director, consulting NEA, and talking to peer principals and stuff like that, what if we're not able to reach it and the secondary director is like, no? I definitely think I would be looking to reach out to alternative contacts at district. I know that like one person is not always the end all be all situation. And I think by talking to other people, and I think doing it in a classy way, not a tattletaling, he said this way, but reaching out and saying, I would like other perspectives that could help me reach a conclusion because I'm really worried. I'd also follow up with my NEA rep, or maybe even look at other lawyers if it looks like I really would want to fight that formal reprimand. And then I would probably go back to the drawing board and reassess some of my options moving forward, because while I really would want to help the kid and like ethically think that this situation is so unfortunate for David, and I think James is just kind of being stereotyped to just directly sent, I think there's more ethics to definitely explore. And then this case study really made me think of the ethics in school, and as a leader, how do you inspire and deal with really tough situations? Because this is a case that could happen in many schools, in your school, if you were to be a leader. I do think this assignment was really helpful for me, like working through one piece at a time. I think it was hard in the way of knowing like there's not, I don't think, one perfect answer of how to solve this. I feel like even my final decision I picked would have a lot of areas for questions and things going wrong, but I think sometimes you just have to go with your gut, find your policy, find your support, find your people that are going to help you. And I think as a future leader, reflecting on this really helps me, because I have practiced address those issues that are not always black and white. I think learning to implement policies in a school setting, and also learning how to deal with those tough ethical issues would be important. I also think I reflect on my own bias. I think right away my initial thing was like, oh, poor David, he's a victim, and he is a victim, and how they paint the scenario. But I definitely think we immediately dismiss James from the story of going to the school, and I don't necessarily think that's right either. And I think that shows my bias of potentially, being known as the rough kid. And then I also think this helped me think of all stakeholders and not just the principal and the kids, bringing in parents, bringing in legal representation, bringing in maybe even other people at district that could be helpful for this. And I think this is a really tricky situation because I do think there is the unknown player these days of media, and I think social media would be very tricky in this situation, because if the parent broadcasted this on social media, this scenario would be very challenging and all eyes would be on the district to try to figure out what to do. So I enjoyed learning more, and here are just some of my references that I used throughout. Some of them were just more how I would approach ethical decision making, so it helped me kind of guide my process through making decisions. And yeah, thank you so much.